I've been asked this question a few times on my series of Q&As. People want to know the difference between a trance channel and a channel.
Well, let's see. When Ramtha appeared to me in 1977, and then began that incredible year from February on, teaching me about the kingdom of heaven, about everything, and then finally one day introducing what I was supposed to do about this. Everything, the wall went out, I saw all kinds of, the wall disappeared, and here was the future rushing like a locomotive into my living room. Things I'd never seen, people I'd never met. And the Ram and me. And when the Ram finally took me out of my body for the first time, I was scared to death. Man, he says, are you going to stay in your body and avoid death, or you want to leave it and see that you've conquered it? That was a great question. That day that I went down that tunnel for the first time and came back, and it was still afternoon. It's a huge day for me. And I didn't know what that was. I didn't know up to that point who Edgar Cayce was. I mean, I didn't believe in astrology. My mother bought books on the subject. I never was brought up in an environment that had so much free time that one could pursue one's boredom for lack of being busy. I never had that wonderful privilege. So when this happened to me, the only thing I had experienced was the church early in my life, which I wrote about in my book, A State of Mind, and realized that the God that I love was not the God that was in this teaching. So I had experiences, but thought everybody had them. So to answer your question, when I wanted to ask Ram what had happened to me, and what does this mean? Who am I? I mean, who am I that saw the cobwebs on the ceiling above my body? Well, I'm looking at my hairdo that I was so, particular about, and my clothes and my clean house, and discover I was up by a cobweb. And who was it that was seeing that? And who was it that went through this tunnel? And went rushing through that tunnel and hit that wall of light and came back. And I'd never be the same. I'd never look at myself as the same. So I said to the Ram, so what am I doing? I said, well, I just took care of your body while you were gone. I said, well, did I die? I said, yes, in a sorts, you died. Meaning that if I hadn't been here, your heart would have stopped beating. Your cells would start exploding in a matter of 30 minutes. So the process of decay sets in and rigor within hours after that. Well, so that begged a whole explanation. So I went to the bookstore the following day after this much involved conversation, and the books fell out on the floor in front of me, and I picked them up, and there are lights all over them. And so this is when I learned about Edgar Cayce, and I learned about a few people that I'd never heard of in my life. And so I go and I said, so am I this medium? Am I a medium? Is this what I'm going to be? Instead of dying, I'm going to be a medium. And Ram says, no, you're not a medium. Well, I'm in a trance. No, you're not in a trance. No, you left your body. You died. You survived leaving your body. And I said, well, what is that? Then what am I? So am I just going to be the reincarnated person? And this is what I am? He said, no, you're a channel. A medium is somebody who goes into a trance state and can pick up the frequencies of infrared, low band, medium band, high band, infrared. And they can see disincarnate entities, they can hear voices, which is natural in every human being. And so they simply block out the environment around them and listen to an environment inside of them at a higher frequency. Cool. Is that what I'm doing? No, that's not what you're doing. Well, what am I doing? Is you're a channel. Channel means you leave your body. a different mind uses the body for expression. It's a very rare event. So there's no such thing as a trance channel. You're either out of here or you're in here. If you are a trance medium, I don't know why we have to say trance. If you're a medium, seems like you're the intermediary between two or more parties, the person asking the question and the people answering it, and you're simply the person who, by proxy, is giving the information. So you're in a trance when you do that, and in a trance simply means that you block out the information and the environment that's around you when you begin to listen to another frequency. That frequency is infrared. Everybody has that capacity. Our midbrain is actually created to modulate infrared and then send those frequencies on to our frontal lobe. In my case, my persona, my observer, my spirit, my soul left this house. So I'm not my brain. My brain is a processing unit. I'm not my body. My body is experimental unit. It's what experiences this reality. But what I really am is greater than that. And so I go to that subatomic world through the transformation of that tunnel. And Ramtha, in that mind of his, is holding my body together through the back of my brain. Now, we have a different being using a body that isn't necessarily theirs. By proxy in a way, but not really. Being uses the back of my brain, has its own connections to my eyes, my mouth. Everybody has this. Her body. So the mind of God could actually turn on in your subconscious and actually distort your reality and bring about a greater one using yourself. So I'm a channel. My job is to get out of the way and to be gone, while another being, for reasons of destiny, uses my body in a mindful way and performs extraordinary phenomenon. So,
who is Ramtha?
Ramtha. Well, I was still finding that out. And after, let's see, he appeared to me when I was 31 years old. So I was a young woman. And I'm 58 now. And he's still an enigma to me. He's a being that lived 35,000 years ago. And of course, we run into immediately science's model of history and archaeology. But there's a lot of problems in explaining Homo erectus when you still find Cro-Magnon, dating back 10 million years ago, skull. So we have a little problem with archaeology and history. Ramtha was here 35,000 years ago. At a time period vividly explained by him over the years, over these long years. And he was a being whose race of people lived in the Pacific, in a place called Lemuria, or Mu. And his race of people came, as he said, from beyond the North Star. Now, this is getting out there. This is coming back where really species of different genesis of beings from different parts of the universe were visiting at that time, still are today, but at that time actually set up races or sections of people. Ramtha was born in Lemuria, was here while the planet was being torn apart, became a very powerful being in a place down by the Gulf of Mexico, at war with another race, and he was endeavoring to make sense of his family's profound spiritual intuitiveness. Their mind was who they were, and they had extraordinary capacity, but trying to make peace with the warring faction, destroyed his family. So there's a great hatred for the God of his own people. And they call that God the unknown God. It didn't have a face. It was life itself. And so he began this remarkable journey of destroying his enemy and everybody else. And he lived this very colorful, extraordinary, warlike life. And fearless. That being would betray himself, end up with a mortal wound, and would sit on a rock for 7 years contemplating his life in deep focus. Rantha then one day had an extraordinary experience, had an out-of-body experience. That out-of-body experience set him on a journey to find out where that came from. So it took him another 7 years to duplicate the experience. So enlightenment came because the mind that he was, through his adversity of illness and sickness, was changed into the mind that could leave the body due to pain. And then that began the quest of discovering that whole new possibility of what he was, and that eventually he would find that the unknown God of his people was actually the source of life. It was and is that where we have our being from. It is that quintessential quantum field. It is that quintessential unfolding and infolding from the eternal void. And that extraordinary intelligence that comes from that is what we really are. And that the unknown God is life itself, and would find himself in a remarkable position of being able to declare that as himself. And then began the journey that once he had conquered and had figured this all out, then he looked at the horizon, which he says, where the gold meets the blue. I want to go there. Well, the mind then begins its journey and the body follows. And so the being worked with frequency, and one day ascended and left his army. In time, so where is he gone? The stairway to heaven is made up of 7 great steps and 7 great frequencies. And Ram went up that stairway. Every time we raise the frequency in our body, and when we do that is because our mind moves to another part of the brain that specializes in that frequency. And when we rest our mind in that part of the brain, then we start to vibrate. And our vibrations throughout our body allows us to move faster than the matter in which we live in. So our frequency becomes fast. He just raised his frequency, and as he modulated his frequency, he raised it higher and higher. And is it possible that a body can vibrate without shattering? He went on and on and on and finally disappeared. Yeah, he disappeared to us, but he's still in time on his own frequency time. So this is a being that lived 35,000 years ago, whose family came from beyond the North Star, who lived a rich and controversial life, was afraid of no one, had an army of 2 million people, and ascended at the end of his life. And where did he go? Where we all want to know. And that information of his journey and his knowledge is who is our master teacher at his school. And he's the one that shows us that we are observers, not just philosophically, but puts us in initiation and shows us we can do anything. This is the being that did it himself and calls us gods. I mean, when was the last time somebody paid you that compliment? That's from them.
So then, back to the original question, which was, do I create my reality, or is reality already existing and I choose that reality?
Creating our reality is a fundamental principle of the school, and it is also one of the reasons that we arise to the concept that we're divine, that to be creators means to not only imagine something and make a better cherry pie, but the very fact of the people, places, and things and times and events in your life that constitute your life is your reality, and that they're all specific to your neural net. And when a person says, do I create my reality? The answer is, but you already are creating it. That who you are is made up of the reality that you are currently. To change that, to augment that, would be to change one of those concepts of people, places, things, times, and events, because you became expanded, that you brought into your neurological makeup an idea, that you became that idea, that you embraced that idea. That new idea suddenly augments present reality. And because the idea is now in your mind, it's in your frontal lobe, its reality forms. And suddenly you go, wow, I just had this great experience, I had this idea, and then this wonderful thing happened to me. I mean, what was that? The answer is you created reality. Well, what did I create it from? Sourced from an idea. Well, why don't I do that all the time? But you have. The idea of who you are with, where you live, what you look like, what you wear, who you talk to today, what you're going to do tomorrow, you have all created this as fundamentally your reality. So everybody in your life is an aspect of yourself, and what you did is you simply added to it. You added a new reality to that mix. So we're so busy being it, analogically it. We're talking about, it's like the fish in the ocean. Somebody gives the idea to the fish that it's a novel idea to ask for a drink of water. So the fish asks for a drink of water, everybody starts laughing, because the fish is in the water. So it's sort of like saying, how do I create my reality? Well, you are the reality. You're already creating it. We only see what we are when we step out of it, and we look back at who we've been. And our life and how it has been. That's a reality. The one that we're in now is a different point of view. So, does the reality that you go into already exist? Science suggests to us that parallel universes are living simultaneously, that we're living 100,000 lives, or 5 lives, however much you can handle, simultaneously, and that all the things that we do are at work right now. Our future life is living, our past lives are living. I absolutely agree with that, because I only think that the arrow of time happens to be that way because we've created the reality for time to exist that way. It's the elongation and computation of multiple experiences which happen to be our own. So we say we did all this in one day, and then we slept all night, and then tomorrow we're going to do all of that. Those time lags are our achievements that we put in it, and they're having to do with day and night. But the idea then that we've already had this conversation is absolutely correct, because in no time do we have the possibility of all possibilities. And here's where the many worlds concept of quantum physics becomes so fabulous, and is one of the things at the heart of Ramtha's model of physics, that we are the observer. And whatever we observe through the new idea, the new concept that we put in our brain, that we hold and focus upon, becomes the observer in quantum physics that actually calls up from the ground of its being. The beginning process is in the very tiny that begins to augment our day. And so the day that we would have had fades away, and the new day suddenly takes its place. And that all of these are simultaneously is absolutely correct. So you could say, well, how can I be in the future if I don't even know who I am that's in that future? But the very fact that the future exists is only a state of mind. And it's in our mind that matters the most. So how do we reach out and take advantage of simultaneous worlds? By permitting ourselves to have knowledge that threatens the old paradigm of our mind that has come to a conclusion about life. Can never come to a conclusion about life. Life is an eternal thing, just as we are an eternal thing. And we have to start searching for more meaning of what we are. Well, the meaning of what we are has yet to even be discovered by ourselves. How do we take an ordinary day and make it super extraordinary? By having the knowledge to think about the extraordinary. The day becomes it.
So what are the specifics you think about the message of science and the advanced sciences that people that have reinvigorated people?
I think the main thing is that it's if I wanted to reduce it to a nutshell here, I'd say it's giving back power. Because after all, we're not here searching for something to make sense of my life so that I can live an orderly and reasonably harmonious life without becoming a drug addict or a sex maniac or some other form of escapism. I just don't want to be able to cope with life so that I can go through it in a reasonably harmonious way. I want something more than that. And I often think of Woody Allen's great statement when he said, I don't want to achieve immortality through my works. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. So let's get real here. I mean, we're not here about coping. We're here about assailing some of the most sacred bastions in human history that were ever placed there. In other words, can I dictate the kind of life that I'm going to experience? Can I avoid becoming a helpless pawn at the hands of powerful and manipulative people? Am I just a cog in a wheel, or is there something more to life? Am I going to be able to escape falling prey to sickness and disease, or perhaps even death itself? I mean, it seems to me, looking at the great sources that we all have, that we were never meant to die. Never meant to die. And now, of course, it's an absolutely taboo subject. You're dismissed as a completely unrealistic fool if you even suggest some of these things. So that's what I think the movie has awakened in the hearts of many people, not just a coping mechanism so that we can go to the grave, more recollected and serene, but far more than that we can now take control of our lives. So that's why I say I think the movie is about power.
So along the same lines, why is it so important? Because as you know, in this film, we addressed through you addressing some of what we thought were the misconceptions about God, and we addressed religion, and actually to some extent we dressed religion down. Why is it so important to do that? People have said, it's a long question, people have said, well, you didn't have to be so mean about, religion, you didn't have to be so mean about all that. Why is it so important to address that before talking about some of these concepts which are probably more evolved?
Mm-hmm. I think the religion was not addressed in the movie. It was mentioned in the movie. And I think the movie was an essential prelude to dealing with religion, but religion has not been dealt with yet. And the reason why it's so important is because even though people may have thrown off the trappings of religion in their everyday lives, they may even say they're atheist or agnostic, nevertheless, in the very culture we have grown up in, we have absorbed the religious mentality and the religious framework, which I call the hamburger universe. They have absorbed that. So even, if we think of a religious person as someone who goes to the temple or synagogue on Friday night or the mosque on Saturday or church on Sunday morning, that's not what a religious person is. That's a practicing religious person. But a religious person is what almost everybody in the Western world is, because they're living within a framework, within a matrix that has been totally molded by ways of thinking about the relationship of God to the world that have nothing to do with reality. So why is it necessary to talk about religion even to an agnostic audience? Because the agnostic audience is totally religious, hook, line and sinker. And the problem is only exacerbated by the fact that they're not aware of it. So if we need to address the issues about religion, it's not whether I go to Mass on Sundays that's the issue, or the synagogue. It is, what way do I think about the world? What meaning has my life? What should I do? I mean, am I supposed to be here looking at a list of commandments, 570 in the Jewish faith, or 700 and something in the Muslim faith, or 10 in the Christian faith? Am I here to obey those so that I can get tagged on to the end of my life as some sort of reward, some sort of optional extra that I can exchange, in the international currency exchange as I pass through the gates of heaven? Is that why I'm here? Of course it's not. But can we ever transcend into that other different way of looking at reality without addressing the roots of the problem? You cannot. And the roots of the problem in all people are religious today.
So you're saying that even though somebody has abandoned and walked away from their religion, that the effects are still with them?
Absolutely. And they don't even know it, which is even worse. I mean, I had an incident once in Australia some years ago, and I was talking about the heaven and hell idea, that Grandpa had asked me to talk about. And this young man of 20 years of age or so said to me, that was really interesting, but thank God, he said, thank God, I am not religious, he said. I said, is that so? And he said, yeah, I'm not religious. My parents had no belief, and I grew up without any beliefs at all. And he had told me the previous day that his father had died when he was 8 years old. So I said, do you mind me asking, where did they tell you your father went when he died? He said, well, they told me he went to heaven. I said, that sounds suspiciously like a religious view to me. And I went down through the list, 20 things or so, belief in right or wrong, retribution for good and bad deeds, etc. And on every single one of them, he passed with flying colours as a person with a profoundly religious outlook on reality. He was never in a church in his life, synagogue or mosque, but a perfect religious person.
The idea of God being outside somehow, the idea of that the universe happens to us, the idea of the sky on a cloud, where does that come from? Where do our current ideas of God and where the power resides in the universe, where do those ideas come from?
There are tantalizing hints in some of our most sacred texts, even within the Jewish, Islamic and Christian faiths, because those faiths essentially are all the same. They come from Abraham, and they're tied to the Western religious traditions. But there are tantalizing hints in those texts even about a race of beings, mysterious and so forth, called the Elohim, called the Nephilim. And if you only investigate slightly, you'll find that there's an awful lot more to these ancient texts than we've given them credit for. So I'm not going to go into that here now because it's impossible in this short space of time and would only do more damage than good. But what I am saying is that all of this stuff, the ways in which we think of God, which is basically an enlarged human being up there in the skies, who has given commandments and was scrutinizing us from above, all of that has come from our history. It's not essential in our nature. It has come from historical conditioning, which is far more ancient, I think, than the present acceptable, politically correct understanding of the origins of the human race can give it credit for. And I think if that understanding of our history were known, it would put into utter irrelevance by comparison all those dated and outmoded debates between the creationists and evolutionists, because the truth isn't there. The truth is much farther back behind each of those. But that's a big day's work. So if you're asking me where does our tendency to think of God as a human being enlarged, with basically the same virtues and the same faults and failings as human beings, where does it come from? It comes from our history. It's not inbuilt in our nature. And the only way out of that is to have a better understanding of our real history. That's a big job.
What does it mean when we say God is within?
Usually, when we say God is within, it means very little, because it's just one other container into which he has been stuffed. I mean, we've given up thinking of God as up there, and the Australians thinking of him as down there, and others thinking of him over on the right or the left. We've given up that crude idea. God is a visitor from outer space who comes in to do miracles and to perform gracious acts on my behalf. But the buzzword, of course, is now that God is within. Jesus used it. I mean, it's as old as the foundations of the world, this idea. But I think the important point to understand is when we say that God is within, that we are not speaking of ourselves as a container within which God is enclosed. And I always think of that old image of the alien movies with the creature bursting out of your chest. You know, God is not like that within us. He's not encased within us. When we say the kingdom of heaven is within you, as Jesus put it, rather than God was within you, then we're talking about a complete identification of our being with the divine source that's at the origin of it all. I don't like using the word God, and I do not like using the word Spirit. Why? Not that I'm against God, which would be a rather defeatist attitude. Someone asked Abraham Lincoln one time in the Civil War, he said to the president, God is on our side. And Lincoln said, I'm not sure whether he is or not, sir, but I sure as heck hope that we are on his side. So when we're talking about God, you know, we're thinking of him as a person, as a human being. And that's why until you get past that, you can't really discuss anything about God with anybody. In my opinion, the word God, because of its associations with that superhuman human who's up there with the beard, the clouds, and the book of life, and the computer, and the laser science, he is what I think of when someone tells me you are God. And I know I'm not sitting on a cloud with a long beard. Therefore I find it hard to absorb this fact. Ranta's teaching, where he uses the word .0, I find is much better, because to my mind the word God is beyond rehabilitation, and so is the word Spirit, because it's become burdened with so much irrelevant and erroneous baggage from the past that we'd be much better served to drop the word and use another term that does not have that history tied to it.
In the film, you said something to the effect of, we're far too hung up on morality and good and bad. And I know a lot of people have said, well, what does that mean? Do you abandon, any sense of, being righteous or virtuous, any of those ideas? So why is it important then to abandon an idea of morality in order to have a more evolved perspective?
Well, I haven't had the advantage of seeing the movie 50 times like some people here have, unfortunately. That's nothing to do with anyone's fault except my own. But I think I did say in the movie that there is no right and wrong. Does that mean that it's a free-for-all? Absolutely not. I mean, the problem that I have with right and wrong in those categories is not that I want a free-for-all, but that right and wrong doesn't go nearly far enough. I also have a problem with words like miracle. I mean, is levitation a miracle? Is walking on water a miracle? Is the multiplication of reality in your hand a miracle? Or is becoming invisible a miracle? N-O is the answer. They are not miracles. They're simply availing of higher forms of physics which we do not yet know. In certain religions, if you levitate, you can become canonized. Of course, the catch is that you've got to die first. However, they never canonize anyone until they're safely dead in case they kick over the traces subsequently. But I am not against right and wrong in itself. I'm simply saying that, like the word miracle, it's too poverty-stricken a term to capture the grandeur of what's actually involved. Because a miracle suggests something that has been bestowed from above by a benign God who's pleased with your progress. So you get a reward. You levitate because God's pleased with you. You levitate scientifically because you have exerted a Torsian field which runs counter to gravity. And if it's strong enough, it'll allow you to float. There's nothing mysterious or miraculous about it. It's far more wonderful than any miracle. Likewise, with right and wrong, they don't go far enough. Because all that says is that I am guiding my life by a set of rules given from above by this creature, God, because he is a creature on a cloud. So what am I replacing that with? I'm replacing it with a far more enlightened understanding by which we might guide human behavior, which is far more exacting and demanding than a system of right and wrong could ever be. Because what am I saying is that there are actions that evolve me, and there are actions that regress me. In other words, if you just use Newtonian physics, to every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So if I do something, I know in the structure of the universe that I'm in that the effects of that are going to come back to me, and that I must one day, whenever it is, sooner or later, I must deal with it. So that's what I want to suggest as a criterion for behavior, not this crude right and wrong, obeying rules of some superintending deity in the clouds with a LASIK satellite system to see the number plates on your car. No, I want you to understand that in the whole course of evolution that we're involved here, when we're advancing into it by the use of quantum insights into nature, that everything I do, I must answer for. It's all going to come back to me. And therefore, I have to be very, very careful what I do. Far more careful than right and wrong, because as you know, the whole system of right and wrong is just being construed as a barrier to protect me from God making too many demands. I've done what was asked of me. Tick, tick, tick. Don't ask any more. Now, if we're seriously interested in human evolution, we're not interested in some sort of insurance policy to protect us against God's demands, which is what right and wrong is. We're interested in what can I do to bring out the powers that are in me. Because as I said to you at the start of this interview, what are we about here in this world? Not theories to help me to live more in a more balanced way with adversity and so forth, so that I go to my grave, a recollected person. No, we're interested here in power. And it's not about, soulful ideas of love and goodwill towards all things. We're interested in power, because if I have power to dictate the circumstances of my life, to dictate that I am no longer the toy of powerful and manipulative people, then a lot of the issues that have plagued humanity, which come basically from fear and unworthiness, which, as I said to you, are historical in human history, then all those will fall away. So the seat of evolution is the acquisition of power. And that is where the whole relevance of these 7 planes come in, as I explained earlier on.
In the film, Ramtha says, how can you sin against God? What do you think he means by how can you sin against God?
Well, I think you have to take that in the context that he said, if we take this analogy of his, that point zero self-reflected, and that produced what you and I are today, spirit, for want of a better term, and we badly need a better term. Well, that's me up there. I have incarnated in 7 different planes a multitude of times, and my soul has recorded those adventures. But my only direction when I left that point was to explore the unknown. For anything that I can do here is an exploration of the unknown. So there is no sin in terms of what I do. We will eventually learn that there are certain things, if we do them, that we are infringing what I said earlier, the action-reaction thing, and we've got to learn that. But there's nobody keeping records up there. The records are here, and I'm going to have to deal with them. That's far more painful than a record-keeping God up in the skies. So I think anyone who's setting out on the path of enlightenment will be absolutely impeccable in everything that they do? Is it because of fear of damnation? No. Or of the punishment of God, or because I have sinned and haven't got forgiveness? No, no, no. I mean, these are all excuses that keeps us away from the real problem. The really enlightened person will see every action has a reaction with which I must deal. And if I'm wise, I'm not going to do stuff that will cause me to have to face it and resolve it and balance it in my soul later. That's the real criterion. So you cannot sin against God, because there is no sin against God. So how can we perform that action? Because the divine presence is in us all, and we are fulfilling the divine mandate in everything that we do. We will find out quickly enough, because of the action-reaction reality, that there are some things that do not involve me, and we'll have to learn that sooner or later. But can you sin against God? That's impossible. And it implies an idea of God and God's will for us that belongs to the hamburger universe. It doesn't belong to reality.
What do you think about all the fuss and the phenomenon?
What the fuck, man? It's a phenomenon, as you said. What word can I say about this film? It's awesome. I'm really proud of everyone who's been involved in this film. Will, Betsy, and you, Mark, everyone who made this film. I remember when we did this film in Portland, and I was thinking to myself, how is this going to work? But from the start to the end, you guys had faith in the project. You knew that it was going to be a phenomenon, a blockbuster of independent films. And
tell me about some of the fans and what they talked to you about.
Fans? There are mucho fans. Mucho fans. Any time of day, anywhere I go, anyone I walk up to, day or night. People come up to me and say, "What the bleep?" And I say, "Yes." And they say, "Oh my God, I saw the film 2 times. What the bleep?" I said, "Yes." "Oh my God, I saw the film 10 times. Every time I see the film, we go to get coffee afterwards and we talk for hours and hours and discuss the film." Everyone says that, from the busboy to the flight attendant on the plane. It's amazing. I'm just amazed.
So what do you think it is that's touched people from your perspective?
It's touched a lot of people because it's almost like an eye-opener. It's an eye-opener for people. It's a very brave and straightforward message. And it's there, and that's unusual. A lot of people don't want to look at themselves, or at least they haven't been willing to look at themselves. People were living in complete denial. But this film, and once you see this film, once you listen to this film, you understand, oh, it makes you think. And oh, we need to have a discussion. And oh, we need to see it again and have more discussions. And you slowly open up to the messages in the film. It's almost like creating a new you.
You did something very brave in the film. You know, the scene in front of
you. Oh, really?
I wonder.
Why did you decide to go for it? Because I know at first you had reservations, but in the end you decided to go for it. Just let's talk a bit about your experience. You and I had that big argument. I eventually, blackmailed you and manipulated you into doing it. Why did you?
Well, you, Mark Vicente, gave me no choice. You held my paycheck behind my head and said, "You can't get this until you do this scene." No, actually, in all honesty, it was one of the most difficult jobs I have ever done in my entire career. That scene. I've done tough scenes. I've had scenes where I've had to pull out emotions from the bottom of me and memorize lines, but this one scene was nothing in comparison to the other things that I've done. I decided to just go for it because first, it was part of the film, it was part of my character, and it was part of me, Marley, as well. That was part of this, and I took advantage of this. The part of me, Marley, that was part of this character's scene. I lost sleep for 2 weeks over this scene prior to doing it, and I never slept better afterwards.
So, a lot of women's lives have been touched by seeing that, and people have learned to love themselves in ways they never had before. How does that make you feel?
Well, I mean, I'm extremely proud that I was able to, quote, entertain and show women out there who, just like me, could not accept themselves, their bodies, their looks, the little things about themselves, whether it's their personality, whatever makes up their lives, identifying with all women. We all identify together. If a woman said she doesn't identify with this scene, she's lying. If she said, oh, I'm 100% fine with who I am, I think it's bullshit. Total bullshit. I would understand if a woman said, I accept myself the way I am, then I would say, fine, that's right.
You said to me that you know how to create reality, you said to me. Because you said to me that you create
my existence is the best example of creating your own reality. Doesn't that make sense?
Tell us.
Well, growing up deaf, people have a different conception of how or who you should be. You're deaf, we should feel sorry for you. You need extra attention. You need extra schooling. You need extra care. You need to be looked after. Poor thing, she's deaf. And for myself, I looked at it in a normal way. I had and decided I would have a happy childhood. I accepted the way I was, the person I was. I was a deaf person. Becoming a woman. And when I became that woman, it was an entirely different thing for me. I still, every day, try to accept and understand the different things that are within me, and I have a great deal more to accept, to incorporate.
How did you, with the odds against you, I mean, you were, this deaf actress, with the odds against you, how did you win an Oscar?
Well, when I auditioned for Children of Lesser God, I was 19 years old. And at the time that I was auditioning for the film, they had already been looking for people for 2 years to play this part. They were using people who had already established themselves in the deaf community, big names in the deaf community. And then I came into the picture, and all hell broke loose. People said, who the hell is Marley Matlin? She's just a girl from Chicago, Illinois. She just got out of high school. And it just so happened that they liked my work, the way I looked, whatever it was. And everyone held their breath until they saw the film. They were watching me like hawks. And I was completely oblivious to what was going on out there. I was oblivious to fans. I was oblivious to the deaf community outside of Chicago. I was oblivious to Hollywood. I was more worried about getting my lines right. I was more worried about my boyfriend at the time. And then I finished the film and went to summer school at the National Theater of the Deaf in Connecticut. And I couldn't complete my schooling there, their coursework there. I mean, it was like the last week. I was called by Paramount to go do publicity. I'm thinking, okay, whatever. But they told me to do it. I went to do it. It was part of my contract. The people didn't get it. And when I left, I started to feel some sort of hostility And when I got the nomination for the Academy Award, people were complimentary because there was this part of the deaf community that was proud that a deaf person was being recognized for their work, that I had won a nomination. Great. But what happened was, not only did I have to deal with the odds that were against me from the hearing community, I got it from the deaf community, because when I announced the names of the winners the following year after I won the Oscar, I decided that I would say the names because
I do speak, and nobody knew that. All my life, not yesterday, not 3 years ago. I wanted to talk. I wanted to say all the names. And I did. And the right person came up and got his Oscar, Michael Douglas.
And the day after I did that, all hell broke loose once again, because there was a segment of the community that thought I was trying to indicate to parents of children who were deaf that my speaking was an example to them that they should speak and not sign. This is not something that I had thought of at all. This was, again, labels put on me by other people. And I found out, you know what, I can't please other people. I can't please the fans. I can only please myself. I've learned to let go. I've learned to love what I do. I've learned to take care of myself. I've learned to take care of my family. And take care of myself, as I said. That's the most important thing I can do.
I know what your most frightening scene in this film was. And there are scenes in this film that you have an absolute sense or a look of calm about you. There were moments in the theater when you left the theater, when the character Amanda leaves the theater, when she's sitting on that bench and she wakes up in the morning and you have this incredible sense of calm about you. What were you thinking about? How did you get there?
Well, perhaps at the time when we were shooting that scene is when I learned to grow up, or perhaps I was actually growing up and learning to accept myself and during the making of the film, all the shit that I had within me. And I learned to accept it, and I learned to sort of let it go.
So you had some kind of transformation during the film then?
Absolutely I did. I always do during any film, but in this film I always did. And during your film, absolutely. Every day I came to the set, I was very cranky. You saw me plenty of times. And other times I was happy, and I was happy-go-lucky Marley. Because I felt good as a result of what we did. And those days when I was cranky was because I was struggling with whatever issues were happening at the time. Again, what better time to do this film than... I'm so grateful for this film. I'm so grateful that I was part of it. I'm so grateful that I got to do it.
So, of course, the $64,000 question is, first off, how did you translate what the ACAD quantum physics said? How would you're on a bus somewhere and someone says, so Lynn, quantum physics, what's that mean to me? How do you answer what that means to them?
Well, what it means to them is, first of all, we are all connected. I think the most fundamental thing is we're all connected by an energy field. We swim in a sea of light, basically, which is the zero-point field. And I say, first of all, you get away from the whole idea of separateness, because separateness is the biggest problem of the world now. Separateness causes all the wars in the world. It causes the mine is bigger than yours mentality. I have to have more. I don't have enough. I have to grab this for myself type of idea. So you have to rethink your life in terms of being part of a bigger whole. And secondly, you have to also understand that your intention is going to affect your world, and that what you think, your thoughts, your very thoughts, affect everything that's going on in your life. And so you have to think wisely.
Why does quantum physics say that? And give me a little, like, well, quantum physics says that because.
Okay, I think there's two really important things here that a lot of people touch on. I'll say that again because you may do it again independently. There's two really important elements here. There's the Copenhagen interpretation basically means that reality is unset jello. That's the way I like to put it. There's this just big indeterminate sledge out there that's our potential life, and there's and that we, by our very active involvement, our active noticing, our observation, we get that jello to set. So we're intrinsic to the whole process of reality. Say that again. We're intrinsic to the whole process of reality. Our involvement creates that reality. Now, the second thing that's really important is the whole idea of non-locality, the idea of action at a distance, which is, I call it till death do us part. And it means if you've got two electrons and you move one to Tokyo and one to San Francisco, they both know about each other through time and space. And if one breaks his leg, if he's skiing in Vail, the other one breaks his leg too, even if he's sipping a latte in Colorado. So there's this constant action, and we're finding non-locality everywhere, in our bodies, in space, from stars, in regions of the zero-point field. Everything is connected. And so we have this involvement in everything. We are our world. There's no out there. We are, there's no place where we end and everything else begins. We're all connected. And we also have this involvement in creating our reality.
So when you say that we're all connected and we don't really end, we're all, what is the scientific basis for that? Specifically, what? Because that sounds like a mystic from the enlightened spheres of the Brahmaloka speaking. I mean, but now you're saying it in scientific. What's the scientific?
Okay, this is going to take a long time to try to answer. There are, first of all, there's demonstrations from the work of Fritz Albert Popp that we are beings of light, that we are sending out and receiving small photons, small particles of light. We're sending and receiving photons all the time. Those are small particles of light. And that we're beaming all the time. New research is demonstrating that this is coming out of our very DNA, that this is controlling all the processes of the body, but it's also sending and receiving outside of ourselves. We also know that our communication between our cells occurs in frequencies. This is other work that French scientists did, demonstrating that our cells talk to each other not simply through chemicals, but on a lower nether region through frequency. We also know that there is this ground state energy called the zero-point field, which is, many scientists believe, now people have lots of different names for it, the vacuum, the strict constructionists call it the vacuum, the loose constructionists call it the zero-point field, and I like the zero-point field because it speaks to us. It's a good metaphor, and it's an easier one to digest, I think, than many of the other kinds of metaphors for this lower ground state energy. But it's a very important aspect of energy because governments like, organizations like NASA, British Aerospace, are all trying to tap into this incredible, unimaginably large energy sea. And they feel if they can tap this, we can travel to different galaxies. So they understand that in empty space, there is this unbelievable energy. But we are doing a little energy dance all the time, not only with the photons that we're sending and receiving, but we, our bodies are made up of the same stuff as everything else, as this chair, as the tables, as everything that we look at. We all derive down to a set of subatomic particles. And particles aren't just little billiard balls that swirl around a nuclei like we're taught in physics. They're little packets of vibrating energy, and they're constantly passing energy back and forth like a little medicine ball. So what's going on is a little tango between our electrons and the electrons of the zero-point field all the time. So we're sending and receiving, we're getting information back and forth. And remember, waves are units of information. They're constantly, when they interfere, they're constantly absorbing more information. Many scientists have come up with information like with magnetic resonance imaging, demonstrating that these waves have they're little holograms of information that can be regenerated, that have a history of information about the structures they come from. So we're talking about a sea of not only unfathomably large energy, but a memory bank of everything that ever was, just out there in empty space.
The first question, if you, some sort of fairly concise thing about the question about, okay, you said we're all connected, but how does that change my experience when I go into a grocery store? I mean, how does that worm its way in so it's something more than just an intellectual concept?
I think, first of all, it's studying what other living things do and understanding that you're part of this giant ecosystem. So maybe there's some timings that are good times to do things and bad times to do things. We know now we're affected by the planets. We watch animals. And animals are hugely affected in their intention and their ESP abilities by certain things. I mean, pigeons can't navigate their way home when there's a geomagnetic storm. So maybe we look at ourselves as part of a larger thing. We also look at other cultures where you realize that there is this reciprocity thing. I mean, when we go into a grocery store, you try to get one over on someone. If they make a mistake on the price, you laugh about it and you just you basically take the thing without paying what you're supposed to pay for it. Well, maybe you look at things in a larger way of saying, well, no, the universe has a reciprocity here. In other cultures, if you paid too much or too little for something, the seller would give you something more. If you paid too much, they'd give you another thing as well. If you paid too little, they might cut a piece of it off because they believe that there's this sense of equality there. When you take it, it would affect our raping of the planet, which is what we're doing now. If you think that you're part of something bigger and this is all you're not going to destroy the ozone layer. You're not going to destroy the forests. You're not going to think all the time in your businesses about how you always have to make a profit. Maybe we have enough. Maybe we just have to work out how to sustain what we have instead of constantly having growth. With children, you're not going to just tell them, get out there and win on the football team. You're going to teach a more cooperative way of working with other children, that you sit in a circle. You don't have to be called upon. You don't have to be humiliated in education, in your school. Maybe you just quietly go out and learn by observing, as native cultures do. And when the child knows it, the child comes back and everybody applauds the fact that he has information. You are going to listen to all your intuitive things and not listen to just what the radio says. If you intuitively don't think it's going to rain, don't bring your umbrella. Listen to your intuition, not the weather report. So you're going to access other forms of information rather than the ones that you see with your five senses and the ones that you're told. you're also not going to listen to what they tell you all the time. And start, now it's going to have some global effects too in the way that and it's already starting with things like peace universities and things like that, but other ways of looking at things. And it's also going to grow in tiny groups where small groups can start talking together about other ways of being. That we don't have to just do it this way, where it's dog eat dog. I don't have enough. I want what you have kind of ways of doing. And as I say, many times when I found myself, I put my cup out and it gets filled. And oftentimes against impossible odds. Ed Mitchell said that to me. I said to him, how did you ever finance the Institute of Noetic Sciences and put 4 kids through college? And he said, trust the process. He said, I trusted the process. I got my kids through school. Whenever I needed money, it came my way. I just trusted the process. So I think it's oftentimes not so much a striving, that the true intention isn't really a striving and a forcing. It's a letting go. And it's an acknowledgement of allowing things in. When you talk to all the best healers in my study that I talk about in my book about the AIDS patients, where they had healers all across America, and they took a batch of terminal AIDS patients, and they each were given a different patient to pray for a week. And they traded patients, so it wasn't just one kind of healer. There were about 50 healers. The healers, it was demonstrated without a shadow of a doubt that distant healing worked. And that these guys, the AIDS patients who were prayed for, got better. The AIDS patients who were the control group, who were not prayed for, got worse. And what all of the healers who were effective were saying is about letting go, about opening yourself up to a greater power coming in, and that just saying, please, may this person be healed. So, without trying to sound really corny, it's relearning how to really pray. And I'm not just talking about praying to the white man in the beard who sits on a cloud upstairs. I'm talking about praying to a larger entity, a real sense of the divine, and trying to allow that into yourself and allowing yourself to be just part of that flow, almost like a channel for it. And that really is perhaps the ultimate way that we start really understanding how to live the field.
Well, I wanted to ask you this question. This is a perfect lead into it. This whole thing about religion and sort of where we're going in consciousness or modern spirituality, what's the difference between your traditional dyed-in-the-wool religion and sort of the world that you seem to be Columbusing without a compass into?
Okay. There's different metaphors for the same thing, basically. Our current idea about religion and ancient ideas of religion are part of man's intuitive sense of the divine, intuitive sense of the force or the field. We've all had an intuitive sense that there's a larger unity there. And so really the field, you could call it the Holy Ghost, or you could call it the field, but it's the same thing. I think our sense of religion now is one of the problems with organized religions, though, is that there is this sense of separateness, that it's only good to be a Protestant, or that people who are Catholics are the only people who know the way. And I think now our current understanding of quantum physics is this understanding of complete unity, and so that we have to derive our spirituality from a sense of unity, and really all working together, rather than, again, this kind of sense, a different kind of separateness, a separateness with a different label. But I think it is really what I looked at was really a science of the miraculous. And it's really understanding that there's scientific proof for those things that we've always intuitively understood but never had proof for it. Now we do.
And what's the top 3 on the hit list in your mind of the scientific proof of the miraculous? And not going into detail, just kind of like at a chapter heading, what would they? Because that's a very intriguing thing you say. It's like, oh, really? What?
Okay.
What, you know, it's for people watching the movie. They're like, well, I fell asleep for the last 10 minutes. I need the top three here.
Okay. I'm just going to think for a second. You're talking about studies and things like that. Okay. I think the top three. I think the top three scientific. No, let me just say this again. I think the top three hit list, as far as I'm concerned, in scientific evidence of the divine, is one. All of the evidence that thought can affect living systems, and we're talking about thought can affect healing, and the evidence that healers actually have an energy that can be palpable, can be measured, and can affect people, so that we don't need a lot of equipment. We just need our hands, basically, to make people better. I think that's number one. I think two is the idea that our thoughts last forever. Our thoughts can affect things backward and forward in time, and all the evidence from the REG machines to remote viewing to even prayer. There have been some studies demonstrating retro prayer. That you can pray for people, and that we might be able to go back and fix what happened and make it better. That maybe there's no beginning and end to things. Maybe there's just a continuum that we can make better and improve on things. And the third is, I think, the power of the group. That there is more and more evidence demonstrating that if one person has power with intention, that with the random event generators are demonstrating that all of us are affecting them all the time by our collective thinking. So it really means that we have to all get together and start thinking the same good things at the same time.
So, Dan, there's talk of the mind and body being inextricably connected, and how are they connected exactly?
Mind and body are inextricably connected, and it's proven over and over again in so many arenas of science that you can't separate mind and body. They're one integrated whole. We are this integrated system that can't be broken down into parts. And we can't say mind is here and body is here. That doesn't work. The problem is that for a few centuries, there was this pressure against looking at mind and body as an integrated whole. Back in the 17th century, we came out of a period of time where we saw the universe as this living, vibrant entity to that of the world as a machine. And with that, scientists came along, such as Descartes and Newton, which solidified that concept because they were describing science and mathematics of a non-living world, of inanimate objects, and did some very beautiful calculations and enhanced our understanding of non-living systems. Descartes really looked at the world as a machine. He was very interested in clocks. The problem is they applied this model of a clock or a wind-up toy soldier to living systems as if we understood the parts, the different components of the system well enough, we would understand how the system works, as in a clock. The problem is we're not a machine at all, or a clock at all, or a toy soldier. There was some pressure in the other direction then, a little bit of uprising in the 18th century with philosophers such as Goethe and Kant, for example, who talked about a machine versus a living system and said that the parts of a machine exist for one another, but the parts of a living system exist by means of one another. Really, the original thoughts about a living system being self-making. But in the 19th century, the pendulum pushed even further in this mechanistic way of looking at the world. And by mechanistic way, again, we're talking about a reductionistic way of looking at living systems where if we understand the parts, if we keep going smaller and smaller and separating the parts from the system and looking at components, then we'll understand how the whole works, which got perpetuated in the 19th century with the discovery of the microscope, Virchow, and then we had the germ theory of disease, which Pasteur helped with. And again, we're looking at then smaller and smaller ways of understanding the bigger living system. So looking smaller and smaller at cells to understand the whole system, looking at a germ in terms of why does illness occur, and really setting aside what's going on in this system. The reality is that the germ is only part of the problem when somebody becomes infected. What about the state of the host, the person, or the animal, or whatever living system gets infected by the virus or the bacteria? Why if we were to go outside and 10 of us breathe in the same bacteria that's floating around, 1 or 2 of us might only become ill with that particular pathogen, whatever it might be. And the idea of looking at what's going on in the system, what's going on in the larger whole, got set aside again to keep looking at smaller and smaller parts, which perpetuated this idea that mind is a part, all of the different parts of the body are parts, and looking at things in this very reductionistic kind of way. Yeah, in the 20th century, there was a dawn of a new biology that helped us to understand that the system and the larger whole, and understanding the interrelationships between the components in the system, were the most important thing to consider. For example, Driesch did the famous sea urchin experiment, where at the two-cell embryonic stage, where there's only 2 cells to this developing sea urchin, he destroyed one of them. What he found was that you didn't get half of a sea urchin, you got a whole sea urchin. It was a little bit smaller, but the system regenerated itself so that the components of the system were made by other components of the system. No machine can do that. Only a living system can do that.
So, Dan, it sounds a little bit like, you're starting to sound a little bit like the physicists we've spoken to, because they're going down into deeper levels of reality and now finding some kind of implicit order. It sounds like in your field you find the same thing. Do you see a connection between your field and what they're doing right now?
There was a debate in science for a long time, starting back in the days with Aristotle. What's more important when you're looking at a thing, substance or form? Substance being the components of the thing that constitute what this thing is, and form being the pattern of organization. And for a very long time, substance is what predominated. The pattern of something got lost in some way. What we found is that when we're looking at a living system, the pattern of organization that's going on inside the living system is what's most important, although we also need to understand the components as well. And modern day science has helped us to understand this principle as well. For example, in quantum physics, the smaller and smaller you look at the parts, the less the overall structure matters in a way. When in quantum physics you get down to the atomic and subatomic level, you don't have any things. An electron is not a thing, it's a charge. In quantum physics, what you have is a complex interaction of events, and that you're not left with any things. And that in a whole, at different levels of order, the things that you try to reduce to in a reductionistic kind of way, it doesn't work out. For example, the temperature of a gas doesn't really matter at the subatomic level. The temperature doesn't play any role in what's going on. For example, the taste of sugar is not present in the individual hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen atoms that constitute sugar. At that higher order of level, that higher level of order, you have the taste of sugar. So when you break things down into smaller and smaller parts, what you lose is the organization of the system. And you can't understand the complexity of the system by looking smaller and smaller at its parts. You have to understand the workings of the system, the pattern of the system. So components are important, but the pattern of organization and the levels of order are important as well to understand how a system works. And so in all of the modern sciences, especially when they're applied to the life sciences, you can't understand the workings of the whole, the larger organism, by breaking it down into smaller and smaller components.
Let's talk a little bit about the effect that thinking has on the body. It's been said that disease is often psychosomatic. Is that the case?
People often talk about things being psychosomatic, so to speak. And of course, when you appreciate that mind and body cannot be disconnected in any way, that mind is just the process of any living system, then we know that mental life is very much a part of physical life. The perfect example of that is pain. Pain has its origins in what we call nociception. There's receiving sites that these receiving sites in the nervous system which go to certain areas of the brain, and then what happens? It's not really pain until there's a mental evaluation of that. So that pain requires an evaluation in mental life. When you're unconscious, you don't actually feel pain. You feel pain when you're conscious. It's part of mental life. But then again, what isn't? So the idea of things being psychosomatic, I suppose that idea has been around for a very long time. And even, the founder of modern psychiatry, Sigmund Freud, back in his day was a very accomplished neurologist who translated texts in neurology amongst 3 or 4 different languages, began to really take note and think about some of the things he would observe in his neurology clinic. For example, people who had seemingly impossible neurological findings, like glove anesthesia that didn't follow a particular nerve distribution, which led him to think about this paradigm that perhaps mental life can affect what's going on in the body. And actually, there's been numerous studies and just a wealth of scientific validation that substantiates that what goes on in mental life certainly affects the body. How could it not? Again, seeing the mind-body as an integrated whole, there were studies shortly after Pavlov's studies of conditioning, that we could condition an immune response. In fact, I can remember being a university student in the 80s, where we conditioned an immune response in mice. Something that was a neutral stimulus, the odor of camphor, could actually change the level of natural killer cells, one of the white blood cell types that most mammals have that ward off infections and viruses and things like that. So the fact that something that we perceive, which mental life certainly could be extended even beyond that, but anything we perceive from the environment is part of mental life. And keeping in mind that perception, cognition is the process of any living system, that all of those things can affect our physiology. How could they not?
So what would like self-hatred do to the body?
So our perceptions about ourselves affect how we feel and what our health status is. There have been numerous studies to support, for example, that when one is in a state of distress, anxiety, depression, at a point of major life transition, that they're more prone to illness, and that immune function is different, and that white blood cells respond differently. So that what's going on in mental life affects what's going on in physiology. Really, that mind and body are one and the same, flip sides of the same coin, really has been shown over and over and over again. Even something as simple as, there was a great experiment done Stanford University, I believe, where people were given the task of eating something decadent. I think it was a piece of chocolate cake, or perhaps they chose what the decadent thing was. And the people who did it with a sense of guilt and shame actually experienced a transient decrease in immune function, whereas those who were able to just enjoy the experience and savor this wonderful whatever that they put in their mouths actually had a surge in immune status. I think they looked at IgA or IgG levels.
There you go. Love your food. Okay, let's just go further then. What is, are there any, in the research that you've done, have you seen connections between cancer and certain emotional states?
One's emotional state actually affects how one copes with and works through almost any illness state. For example, we recently here at Thomas Jefferson received a grant to look at cancer patients. It's been actually long known in the cancer literature that if people receive adequate emotional support, group intervention, those kinds of things, that their health-related quality of life is enhanced. And in original studies done by Dr. Spiegel, there was actually an increase in longevity. The original breast cancer group that he looked at, there was a longer survival time. It's really debated in the literature if those kinds of interventions increase survival time. But what is not debated, what is very clear, is that certain types of interventions actually can enhance the quality of a person's life, regardless of their disease state. So somebody who's suffering in terms of their distress level and how well they're able to enjoy life, that suffering can be decreased by addressing what's going on in mental life.
Are you willing to suggest, though, that, as we're talking about interventions, though, but are you willing to suggest that the mind state may actually manifest the disease?
It's hard to know to what degree any one part of the system contributes to a particular disease state. Remember, it's a network, and there's all different levels of the network, and not one level is more important than another. So, for example, when somebody becomes ill, when somebody gets an infection, or really an illness of any kind, I suppose, it has to do with what's going on in the overall system. How is the system compromised? A system can be compromised from primary immunocompromise, from secondary immunocompromise, such as one's emotional state, one's mental life state. So really, what's going on in the system at any one time, we don't know. But all of those things contribute to illness. So it's really difficult to say that any one thing or any one component of the system has everything to do with one's health. That's going back to looking at things in a very reductionistic kind of way. For example, one might be vulnerable to an infection because one is in such a distraught emotional state that their immune system is reacting to that and they're vulnerable. Another person might receive such a huge load of the virus that their immune system just can't overcome it, and they go into an illness state. Another person might have a combination of both going on. So it's really hard to know. And how we are in any one given day changes. That's the thing. We're never in equilibrium. We're always in a state of flux, and we're always in a state of change, which I guess brings us back to a scientific way of looking at us. That's what makes us different than a Newtonian system or a Cartesian system. Those systems are all about non-living systems close to equilibrium. We're never close to equilibrium. We're always fluctuating in one direction or another. The only time that a living system, that we as a living system are in equilibrium, is at the moment of death. And if you look at things that measure or approximate measuring equilibrium, such as heart rate variability, we want high variability. We want to be able to accommodate different situations. Low variability is problematic and suggests that there's actually something wrong. So we're far from equilibrium, and we're constantly in a state of change. I sometimes use the analogy or metaphor of a river, a living system like a river. If we were to walk out to the park right now, to one of the little rivers or streams running through and stand in that, and then come back in and the next day go back out to that stream, or 2 weeks later or 2 months later, are we in the same river? Yes and no. The structure of that river we would still call River X. However, the pattern of that river, going back to substance and form, or structure and pattern, other words for it, the pattern of that river is completely different. There might be different life floating around in there than was there before. There might be a growth of certain types of plant life that wasn't there a few weeks ago. There might be some stones that fell into the river from the river's bank, which weren't there before, which created disruption in the flow. Just like there are things that can happen in a living system that create a disruption of the flow. So all of those things, I think, metaphorically describe what's going on in a living system as well.
So, you asked the question, why God won't go away. If God's everywhere in the universe, how could God go away?
Well, that's true. I mean, I think that when we ask the question about why God won't go away, we were really looking at
how a number of people in the intellectual elite a couple hundred years ago were all saying that we weren't going to need religion or spirituality anymore and thought religion was going to go away pretty quickly. Here we are 200 years later, and obviously something's gone very wrong with that idea, and religion and spirituality are doing extremely well. There's been a resurgence of interest in traditional religions. There's been a lot of interest in different approaches to spirituality, some of the quote-unquote New Age ideologies where people are trying to explore their own sense of spirituality and how it affects them, how it relates to them. And of course science and a lot of researchers are starting to take a new look at how religion and spirituality affect us and what science can help to say about those kinds of issues. So when we think about it and we look around us, we see that religion is made of some pretty tenacious material. And if that's the case, then we ask the question, well, what is it about it that makes it so tenacious? We think it ultimately has to do with how it plays out within the human brain and the human mind, that it seems to map so well onto the functions of the human brain that it's something that just won't go away no matter what happens to us, unless we undergo some evolutionary change so that our brains actually change to trying to do something different for us. That as long as we are the way we are as human beings, spirituality and religion are going to be here for a very long time.
So it has nothing to do with train tickets.
No, and it doesn't, right, and it doesn't ever, in some senses, while we could look at what the objective reality is as to whether or not there is a God or not, even regardless of that particular issue, just because of how we are as human beings, I think we have an urge and a need to be spiritual. So whether or not there actually is a God, in some senses, is not necessarily as important for the question about why God won't go away. It's a part of who we are as human beings, and that has, in some senses, nothing specifically to do with what the ultimate reality of the situation is.
Speaking of ultimate realities, what is it?
Well, ultimate reality, I think, it very frequently depends a lot on how a person perceives it and what they actually think is the real reality of our world. Normally, it refers to a state or an experience that is perceived to be much more real than our everyday sense of reality. It's supposedly the underlying cause and structure of the universe. What it ultimately is made of or comprised of is something that philosophers and scientists have been trying to explore for thousands of years. On one hand, I don't think we have a great answer. I think some of our research at least helps us to understand how to frame those questions. And when we do look at some of the very profound spiritual experiences, we do see that there is a significant understanding in mystical experiences of what some fundamental level of reality would be and what it is, how it relates to us in this reality. And so we certainly, I think, have a lot to look at as far as what the spiritual experiences are of ultimate reality and what that may mean, whether or not science actually will even have access, or at least complete access, to that aspect of reality, or whether science is still more restricted to our everyday sense of reality. Those are going to be some important questions that we're going to have to explore in the future.
Can the no, I'm just rolling here. Oh God, what was the question?
Ultimate reality.
Is there any? How does the brain tell what's real and what's not real? Is there any way the brain can know what's real or not real?
It's not a clear explanation as to why our brain thinks that something feels real. There are certainly parts of our brain that help us to interpret the information that we have within ourselves, comes into us from the outside world, that allows us to put together a very vivid picture of what's going on out there. But why we actually perceive that sense of reality to be the most real is not a clear answer. There's not a clear answer to that yet. People have done some studies looking at hallucinations and what the difference is between something that somebody envisions to be real versus something that somebody actually does see, and what the differences are in the brain. It does appear to have something to do with parts of the brain called the limbic system, which is involved in our emotional processing, and also another structure called the anterior cingulate, which is very involved in our ability to process emotions and also to focus our mind and focus our attention on different things. So it may be some relationship between these structures and these functions that actually identify something as being real and having that that realness feel to it, but why that happens and exactly why that happens in particular circumstances, and why certain types of experiences like dreams may feel a little less real than our everyday reality, and why mystical experiences feel more real than our everyday reality is not something that's clear at this point. So it's a very important question that we have to address, but it really, and it stems from a very important problem that we as human beings must face, which is how do we really know what's out there, what's outside of our brains, and is there some way that we can get outside of our brains or have the brain get out of its own way in order to see what is really out there. And I think that while on one hand science helps us to get part of the way there, what's interesting is that in these mystical experiences that people have, one of the descriptions that they give to it is that it is perceived of as being prior to a subjective or objective sense of reality, meaning that it's really something that exists before we as human beings begin to apply our mental processes to it. It's something that, which is why it feels so fundamentally real. But so it's possible that through spiritual practices and spiritual experiences that we gain access to some level of reality that we don't normally have access to. The real question, though, is how are we actually able to do that, and what is it that we're actually touching when we do touch those levels? When people have a mystical experience, what usually happens, how they describe it, is that they begin to lose the usual sense of material reality around them. In fact, if they go far enough and they achieve a sense of absolute unitary experience, then all of the material world as we typically know it basically goes away. What we're talking about there is an experience of just pure being, pure awareness, pure consciousness. So it's not necessarily tied to anything material, and because those experiences have been described in extremely real terms, meaning that when people have that experience, they perceive it to represent a more fundamental level of reality than our everyday material reality that we normally live in, it creates a very big philosophical problem, because when we actually try to evaluate what is real and how we know what is real, my colleagues and I have ultimately come to the conclusion that the only way to really make a determination is based on how real it feels, what the sense of it feels. Everything ultimately is reduced to that experience. How real of an experience does it feel? How much does it feel like absolute reality? Well, in that case, when we look at the mystical experiences, they really are associated with an experience of much more fundamental reality than what our everyday reality is like. In fact, even when they're no longer having that mystical experience, they still perceive that reality to be the more real, to represent the more truer form, the more fundamental form of reality. And the material world that we live in is kind of a more secondary reality for them. So if that's the case, then we need to really look at what is the relationship between consciousness and material reality, whether or not the material world can actually be derived from a consciousness reality, or whether consciousness itself could even be the fundamental stuff of the universe, so to speak, instead of the cold dark matter or the other aspects of matter that physicists have been looking for. Maybe it has something more to do with consciousness. And certainly if somebody comes at it from a spiritual or religious perspective, where, and particularly a theistic perspective, where they're talking about God as the fundamental cause of all being, so everything in the universe basically derives from God's consciousness, and in that regard, then we really can think about the universe as being more a state of consciousness, or more inundated with consciousness, much more so than the material reality that we normally look at. So going back to the idea of what really is consciousness, it really depends on a person's perspective. If somebody wants to be a very materialistic scientist, somebody may say, well, it's just the functioning of the human brain that allows us to be self-aware or aware of our surroundings, that allows us to get around the world and survive. The only problem with that is that it's still very difficult to explain how a mass of neurons and cells and so forth can ultimately become aware of itself, and why it is that if you put the same stuff together in another way, or you take a huge supercomputer with millions of circuits all running at incredible speeds and so forth, why that doesn't have consciousness. We don't know the answer to that just yet, and why it seems, at least at this point, that human beings seem to be at least the greatest source of consciousness in our world.
Are you saying, so that I understand,
Yes.
that when we're in an absolute unitary state, that is more reality than this out here?
Well, that's how it's described by the people who have it. And that's really been shown across the board. There are many different kinds. It doesn't even have to be an absolute unitary state, but a very strong mystical experience. People who have near-death experiences, people who have spontaneous mystical experiences, people who've been meditating for many years and get a sense of enlightenment or some type of mystical experience as the result of that practice. All of those different types of experiences, even if it doesn't go to the extreme of just everything being wiped out and having an absolute sense of oneness, these very powerful mystical experiences are perceived to represent a truer form of reality, a more fundamental level of reality that makes this material world really not mean as much. And some people have described it as an illusion, which I think is sometimes a little strong, but I think the point they're trying to make is that it just doesn't have the realness, the quality of realness that these states have. And the ultimate goal of the mystic then, once they've had that experience, is to kind of keep trying to get back to that experience, because that is, in their eyes, what represents the fundamental level of reality.
So, then what is reality? I mean, basically you got to just answer that, really. I mean,
well, what reality is that's the kind of the crux of the question. When we've looked at how we define reality as a human being, we looked at the criteria of which we evaluate reality and say, well, what is it that makes something real? I mean, there were philosophers in the past that said, look, if I kick a rock and I hurt my toe, that's real. I feel that, it feels real, it's vivid, and that means that it's reality. But it's still an experience, and it's still this person's perception of it being real. So that's certainly one characteristic, which is that it feels real. We bump into things in the real world, we hear things, we hear sirens and so forth, and they all sound and feel and appear very vivid, very real to us. They are also consistent. If we see a car driving down the street, it just doesn't disappear. It keeps going. There's a consistency over time, and we have a sense that when something no longer is there, that it has now ceased to exist in that reality. And we also can do a cross comparison. I can ask you, what do you see over there? And you say, I see a blue car. And I say, I see a blue car. That cross-references me, and I can say, okay, that represents reality. The problem is that if we actually look at all of those criteria about cross-referencing and persistence over time and the feeling of it being real, all of those still ultimately come back to how real it feels to us, because when I cross-reference with somebody, they're part of my reality. So it's still a matter of, if I hear somebody agreeing with what I think is going on out there, it still has to do with what I am perceiving, and whether or not what I perceive is ultimately what I interpret as being real. So when we try to break it down, it appears that reality ultimately comes down to our experience, to the strength at which we sense it. And one of the things that is very important, I think, in terms of evaluating reality is how it compares to our other experiences of reality. So, for example, if we have a dream at night, it may seem very real and very vivid, but when we wake up, we usually say, you know what, that was a dream. It doesn't have that same persistence, it doesn't have that same quality that this reality has. Even though when you're in it, it may feel very real, when you're in this reality, that reality seems secondary. So in many ways, reality can be very relative. And then, of course, when people have a mystical experience, that feels very real. And at that point, they feel that that's more real. But the interesting thing there is that even though they may not be in that mystical experience anymore, when they're in this baseline reality, they still think that that reality was more real. So it's different than the dream state where we say that wasn't real, because now we're saying it still feels more real, even though I don't have any connection to it right now. I still know that that was more real. And we see that time and time again. Even people who are not designed to be mystics, people with near-death experiences, always describe that experience, that sense that they had, the feelings that they had with that, are more real, that makes this reality a whole different situation for them. And it's been documented in many studies that have shown that when people have a near-death experience, it changes their perspective on life, their fear of death, their interpersonal relationships, how they approach their life, how they approach their jobs, their children, their family. So it has very dramatic effects, speaking to the fact that it really felt very real and really had a life-changing consequence for them.
Okay. What was my question? So in the book, you told the...
Let's go back to the investment. I know.
Oh, okay. You told that the infamous Columbus with the ships and lagoons story?
Yeah.
Could you tell that story?
Right. Well, the way our brain is wired up, we only see what we believe is possible. We match patterns that already exist within ourselves through conditioning. So a wonderful story that I believe is true is that when the Indians, the Native American Indians on the Caribbean islands, saw Columbus's ships approaching, they couldn't see them at all because it was so unlike anything they had ever seen before. They couldn't see it. Because we create our own reality and it didn't match.
So what did they see?
The way I heard it, they just didn't see anything. I mean, they just couldn't even see it. Just like it was, they were emotionally unable to deal with it, so they couldn't even see it.
So did they ever eventually see them?
Well, they must have. At some point, I think they sunk a few and killed a few explorers, but I don't know that history. Do you? Do you know about that?
Well, I know the story from your book.
Right.
And actually, I've heard it in other places where...
A long time ago, I knew the whole story, but
yeah,
it was a long time ago.
They got it from the Portuguese priest, and eventually the shaman was out there, and the shaman was the first one who started seeing these weird waves over the water. Typical that a shaman would be the first one. It took him 3 weeks, and eventually you could see it.
You could see it, like they thought it was trees. It's like denial. You don't... I mean, one of the interesting things is, your eyes are moving all the time. And, it's moving over this whole field of energy. And why does it focus and start to let in one area and not let in another? And it really just, we see what we want to believe, too. And we just turn away from some things that are too unfamiliar or even unpleasant.
Do you have any stories of any miraculous healings? The things that would be called miraculous?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Well, let's add one or two.
Right, well, when I was on my, when I started on my book tour that never ends, I call it, I would often meet these people who would come up to me with their x-rays and their medical records. And these were people who had had cancers of various kinds. It used to make me very nervous because, this did not fit into our current paradigm of medicine. But I'm an open-minded person, and these were real people, and these were real medical records. And this, I'm not talking about 2 or 3. I'm not even talking about 9 or 10. I mean, I'm talking about scores of people. Some had written their own little books, and these were people who had some kind of instinct that they didn't want to go through a normal course of chemotherapy. And they had some sense that the cancer, rather than being something external to them, was really part of them, a part that they wanted to understand better. And through their own, people did different things, but a key element in all of it was a visualization, a focus on the cancer, as opposed to being afraid to deal with it. They would get into some heavy-duty mind-body kinds of manipulations. Some would use nutritional work, yoga, etc. And miraculous healings. I mean, miraculous cancers, that large tumors that disappeared in days or even weeks, huge tumors. And I should mention that there's a lot of books, I know of 2 or 3 books because I blurbed them, that are coming up, that are going to be published in 2002, that are going to vividly recount, one's an Oxford professor, how people cure their own cancer without going through a traditional route.
And when you said they were, miraculous healings, you mean that there was like x-rays before and after, and it was just...
Absolutely. I mean, one example, people would have, one woman had a breast tumor. She had a sense that it was caused by her work as an artist and some of the toxic fumes that she had inhaled, and she stopped that, but she also did a lot of inner work and worked out what had happened, and she had a sudden realization about her brother and all their lives, how he had hurt her and this and that, and literally within 48 hours this thing started to swell and burn and fester, and it was gone. And she has complete x-rays of the whole thing, start to finish, pre and post. And of course, a lot of times medical doctors, bless them, they're in the older paradigm, can't really understand this, and so of course they do what the Indians did, who didn't see the ship, and they deny that these things have really happened, and they'll say, gee, maybe the diagnosis was wrong to begin with.
Do you have a theory as to how she was able to make that go away?
Absolutely. I have a theory, and I'm very excited about recent developments in biology and scientific research that show us that our mind literally creates our body, because it has to do with stem cells. And we've all been hearing about stem cells in terms of, be careful, you get them from an abortion and that kind of thing, and how they can help people. But nobody's thought too much about the implications of stem cells in day-to-day. Like, as we're all sitting here, we are all making stem cells in our bone marrow that are exiting our bone marrow and are moving to regenerate our organs, including our brain. And this is, of course, my gosh, this is amazing. People really fought this discovery, and it's really only the last few months that it's been proven by an NIH scientist conclusively that we literally make new brain cells from these stem cells, from our bone marrow. And why? How? Why does one brain cell manage to get to a place of influence and another one turn into another cell? And that, of course, the entire pathway of chemicals that titillate the outside of a cell and help it to decide what kind of a cell to become and help it move into the right place. This is all due to the action of various ligands, peptides and others on the receptors. So this same, quote, psychosomatic network, the actual formation of the network is under the control of these chemicals.
So in the case of the woman whose breast cancer went away, could you be very specific what this happened and then this happened?
Okay.
And I know this is a theory, but...
I'll try, but the big question is, what is cancer? And this is the big burning question of our time. And unfortunately, we've been kind of lied to a little bit. Cancer isn't caused by guilt. It's not caused by suppressed emotions. Cancer is caused by pollution and toxicity within our body. Cancer is our body's response to trying to clean out toxicity. So we have a wonderful system of healing ourselves when there is toxicity. We have cells that come and basically eat junk and gradually are destroyed and excreted. And as you have more of a need for these cells, more of them come. So I think that there's some overwhelming evidence that breast cancer, there's a tiny percentage that's genetic, but most of it has to do with herbicides and pesticides. And the cells are attempting to cleanse that and more cells of that type are made, and it's only a matter of time before mutations occur because there's an overproduction of these cells. And then the tumor cells, they start to go out of control. So in many ways, cancers are stem cells that were on their way toward normal development or normal cleansing, and they kind of took a wrong turn and wound up in the wrong place. And once again, and we have published, Dr. Ruff and myself, that many tumor lines really respond to the molecules of emotion in terms of chemotaxis, moving in a certain direction. So tumor metastasis is really under the control of molecules of emotion.
So how would a realization in this woman's brain, she has a realization about her brother, how could that change
Good question.
the all of that?
Well, again, it's a very deep question. Okay. So let's take this woman who realized something about her brother and then set off some massive peptide secretion that in 2 days absorbed the tumor. What's going on? Well, I think the key thing, once again, are these altered modes of consciousness that are all going on at once. So, there's the tumor itself is secreting peptides. The tumor itself is favoring an altered state that might say, I'm worthless and I just need to get bigger and bigger and grow. And then there might be another competing program that says, I'm not really worthless. My brother was telling me I was worthless all those years for his own aha. And then there's some big aha, and then one altered state can start to dominate over the other, and then whoom, the next thing you know, in ways that we don't understand, there's, we do know different parts of the brain regulate immune activity, and there can be a massive release of chemicals that can change what's happening in the bone marrow, in the spleen, and suddenly there's a bunch of natural killer cells, where suddenly they're all activated, and suddenly they come marching in, surround the tumor, and stop the inflammation, and it might go through an inflammatory phase while it's cleansing, and then it's gone.
Is there a limit to what the body can heal, do you think?
I really believe that the body wants to heal itself, and the limits are in our own minds of what we believe is possible. I think so much more is possible than we appreciate. Here we are at the beginning of the 21st century. Is that where we are? And there's just a lot of modern medicine is about how we have to make things more difficult than they really are. From having a baby, something very simple that our foremothers did quite easily. No, I think we have a really amazing ability to heal ourselves if we believe it.
And do you know of any scientific evidence for that? Because people are always saying, well, that's someone's theory and they're just, they're dreaming. But, we've been interviewing people, or some of the people, well, real scientists wouldn't really, there's no scientific basis for that. Even though everyone knows of miracles, they say there's no scientific basis. So is there anything you can think of that?
Well, there's accounts. There's the documentation of cancer recoveries. There's a book from the Institute of Noetic Science, which documents over 1,000 cases of, quote, miraculous healings. So miraculous healings are documented not just in the cancer field, but in other fields. And once again, the belief system is critical, because I think, yes, it's a psychosomatic network, and yes, some of us, particularly adolescent boys, are, under the control of lower centers. But be that as it may, our brain this is our head ganglion, and it has the ability to kind of override and take charge of all of the other multiple personalities or other modules or other subroutines. And so if you get to believe something really, really strongly, it can fire up and reach every cell in your body and transform your body.
They don't know quite what all the buzz is about, but they know there's a big buzz, a big underground buzz for this very offbeat film.
After seeing the film, I can understand why that would be.
It's a whole theory that lays out why that cartoon is scientifically accurate.
In the supermarket, people say, "You were in that movie."
And after 40 years of being in the business, I've discovered.
You never answered my question.
What question?
How far down the rabbit hole do you want to go?
All the way.
We are all one.
Very difficult to wrap your mind around that.
The first people who did these experiments, those people were flabbergasted.
What?
It's tricky. I don't know if we want to go there. You do want to go there? So.
You should try it.
I want to see
The 0-point field.
Understanding?
It's going to run all by itself now.
You asked the questions in the first movie. Now we're just on the verge of being able to answer those questions.